The wind had a voice on this high, desolate plain. It was not a whisper, but a mournful cry that scoured the land and stripped the warmth from a person's bones. Elara felt it through the thin wool of her coat, a lament for a life she no longer possessed. The train had deposited her like a piece of unwanted luggage onto the splintered platform of endurance, a town whose name felt like a cruel mockery. Dust, the color of rust and regret, coated everything: the raw timber of the buildings, the brim of her hat, the back of her throat. Men in stained coats and women in faded calico paused their business to stare. Their eyes were hard, assessing, their faces etched by the same wind that now tore at her skirts. She was a curiosity, a fragile thing from the east, marked by her clean but well-worn traveling suit and the desperation that clung to her like a second skin. She clutched her small valise, the only thing in this world that was truly hers, and waited. Her heart, a frantic bird against her ribs, hammered a rhythm of pure terror. "What have I done?" The question was a ceaseless echo in the hollow space where her family used to be. Cholera had taken them, swift and merciless, leaving her with nothing but memories that were too sharp to touch and debts that were too heavy to carry. The advertisement had been her last resort, a single paragraph in a Boston newspaper that promised a new life, a husband, a home. It had not promised warmth, or kindness, or love. It had offered survival, and at the time, that had seemed enough. Now, standing under the vast, indifferent sky, survival felt like a punishment. She scanned the faces in the small crowd, searching for the man whose name was a harsh syllable on paper: Silas Blackwood. The description in his letter had been brutally concise. 34 years. Homesteader. Require a wife for partnership in labor. Plain speaking, do not expect comforts. A man detached himself from the shadows of the general store. He was taller than she had imagined, broad through the shoulders in a way that spoke of relentless work. His face was all angles and planes, shadowed by the brim of a dusty hat. He was not old, but the sun and hardship had carved lines around his eyes and mouth. He moved with a heavy, deliberate slowness, his gaze sweeping over her once, a clinical assessment that held no welcome. There was no smile, no gesture of greeting. This had to be him. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes the color of a winter sky just before a storm. "Miss Vance?" His voice was a low rumble, rough as unplaned wood. It was not unkind, but it was utterly devoid of emotion. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. "The wagon is over here," he stated, turning without waiting for a reply. He took her valise from her numb fingers, his hand brushing hers. His skin was calloused and cold. The brief contact sent a shudder through her, a tremor of finality. This was real. This was the man who now owned her future. The journey to his homestead was a silent ordeal. The wagon bucked and groaned over the rutted track, and the world dissolved into an endless expanse of brown grass and gray sky. He did not speak. He handled the horses with an economy of motion, his large hands sure on the reins. Elara sat stiffly on the hard plank seat, her world shrinking to the rhythmic creak of the wheels and the solid, unmoving presence of the man beside her. She stole glances at his profile, searching for a hint of the person within the stoic shell. She found nothing. He was a man made of the same unforgiving material as the land itself. Despair, cold and sharp, pierced her. She had traded one form of desolation for another. As the sun began to bleed across the horizon, painting the clouds in brutal strokes of orange and purple, a structure emerged from the emptiness. It was a small, dark shape against the dying light, a cabin, stark and alone. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a lonely plume in the vast wilderness. This was her new home. It looked like the end of the world. He had not lied. There were no comforts here. She wondered, with a fresh wave of terror, if there was any life here at all. The cabin was larger inside than it had appeared from the unforgiving expanse of the prairie, yet it felt suffocatingly small. A single room served as kitchen, parlor, and, it seemed, bedroom. A large stone hearth dominated one wall, a fire already laid within, its embers glowing with a sullen, watchful heat. The air smelled of wood smoke, pine, and something else, an underlying scent of solitude. Silas set her valise down by the door with a quiet thud that seemed to seal her fate. "The stove is there," he said, gesturing with his chin toward a cast-iron beast in the corner. "The pantry. Root cellar is through the floor there." He pointed to a heavy wooden door set into the floorboards. His tour was a litany of facts, delivered without inflection. He moved to the far side of the room, where a sturdy bed frame was built into the wall. Ilara's breath caught in her throat, but then he indicated a narrow cot set up in the opposite corner, a respectable distance away. A thin mattress and a single folded blanket lay upon it. "This is yours." The relief that washed over her was so potent it made her feel faint. It was a small mercy, but in her terror it felt monumental. He had prepared a separate space. He had considered her, if only in the most practical, detached way. This was a transaction, he had said in his letter. A partnership. His actions confirmed it. There was to be a line between them, clear and unbreachable. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible over the sighing of the wind outside. He gave a short, sharp nod, his back already to her as he stoked the fire. Flames leaped up, casting dancing shadows that made the small room seem alive with restless spirits. He moved with a familiar grace in this space, every action efficient and purposeful. He filled a kettle from a bucket of water by the door and set it on the stove. He sliced bread from a dark loaf and put a slab of bacon in a skillet. He did not ask if she was hungry. He simply prepared the food. They ate in the same silence that had defined their journey. Ilara sat on a small wooden stool, the cot at her back, while he took a chair at the small, rough-hewn table. The only sounds were the scrape of cutlery on tin plates and the crackle of the fire. The food was tasteless in her mouth, each bite a struggle to swallow past the lump of fear in her throat. She watched him from beneath her lashes. His focus was entirely on his meal. He was a man, self-contained, a closed circuit of thought and action. What did he think, seeing her here? Did he regret his decision? Did he find her wanting? She felt a desperate urge to prove her worth, to show him she was not merely a burden he had acquired. After they finished, she stood, her limbs stiff and awkward. I can clean," she offered, her voice sounding thin and reedy. He looked up, his gaze unreadable in the flickering firelight. For a moment, she thought he would refuse, but he simply nodded again and pushed his plate toward the center of the table. She gathered the dishes, her hands trembling so badly she was afraid she would drop them. The simple act of washing up became a monumental challenge. The water in the basin was freezing cold. The lye soap was harsh against her soft skin. She fumbled with the heavy skillet, her grip clumsy. Back in Boston, they had had a girl for these tasks. Ilara had spent her days with books and needlepoint, her hands accustomed to nothing more strenuous than turning a page. Here, her uselessness was a glaring spotlight. She heard him rise from the table, and her back went rigid, bracing for a sharp word, a sigh of impatience. Instead, he took the heavy skillet from her hands without a word. His fingers brushed hers again, rough and warm this time from the fire. He scrubbed the pan with a practiced efficiency, his movements quick and sure. He did not look at her, he did not speak, but in that small, silent action, she felt the full weight of her inadequacy. He had not brought her here for companionship, he had brought her here for help, and on her very first night, she had already failed. She retreated to her cot, turning her face to the rough log wall, and wept in silence. The days that followed fell into a harsh, unyielding rhythm, dictated by the rising and setting of a sun that offered little warmth. Mornings began before dawn, the air in the cabin so cold that her breath plumed in front of her face. Silas would already be up, the fire built, his movements quiet and deliberate in the pre-dawn gloom. He would go out to tend to the livestock, a few scrawny cattle, a handful of sheep, and the 2 horses that had pulled their wagon, and Ilara would be left to confront the alien landscape of the kitchen. Her first attempts at cooking were disasters. The biscuits were as hard as stones. The porridge was a scorched, lumpy mess. She burned her fingers on the stove and wept tears of frustration into the dishwater. Silas never commented on the failures. He would eat what she had made without expression, his jaw working methodically. Then, later, when she was not looking, she would see him quietly tossing the remnants to the chickens. The waste was a deeper condemnation than any words could have been. She began to watch him, her observation becoming a silent, desperate apprenticeship. She noted the precise way he added flour to water, the way he tested the heat of the oven with the back of his hand, the practiced motion with which he chopped wood, each swing of the axe a perfect, efficient arc. His hands, she noticed, were never still. They were always mending a harness, sharpening a blade, whittling a peg. They were hands that knew the language of survival, a language she had never been taught. Her own hands felt pale and useless in comparison. She tried to emulate him, her movements clumsy and uncertain. She learned to knead dough until her arms ached, to pluck a chicken with fumbling fingers, to scrub the floorboards on her hands and knees until the rough wood chafed her skin raw. Each small success was a victory, a tiny foothold gained in this hostile new world. He never praised her, but she began to notice a change. He started leaving the task for her to complete, a silent acknowledgement that she was capable. One morning he left the sourdough starter on the table for her, a clear, unspoken instruction. Her stomach clenched with anxiety, but the bread she baked that day was edible. It was heavy and dense, but it was bread. When he ate 2 slices without a word, she felt a profound, almost painful surge of pride. Her world was the cabin, the chicken coop, and the small vegetable garden, now fallow and frozen. The vastness of the prairie that surrounded them was a constant presence, its silence pressing in on all sides. Some days, the loneliness was a physical ache, a hollow space in her chest that mirrored the emptiness of the land. She missed the sound of other voices, the bustle of city streets, the simple comfort of a familiar face. Silas was her only human contact, and he remained a fortress of silence. Yet she was beginning to see cracks in his armor. One evening, as she was tidying, she discovered a small, hidden shelf behind a loose stone in the hearth. On it were 3 books, their spines worn, their pages softened with use. A copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, a well-thumbed book on animal husbandry, and a slim volume of poetry. He could read. He not only could read, he chose to read words that spoke of beauty and feeling. The discovery shifted her perception of him. He was not just a creature of labor and necessity. There was a hidden depth to him, a secret, guarded interior. The knowledge was a small, warm thing she held close in the cold nights. A few days later, a biting wind picked up, rattling the windows and finding every crack in the cabin walls. She shivered as she worked, her thin shawl offering little protection. When she turned from the stove, she found he had left his own heavy wool coat draped over the back of her chair before heading out to the barn. He said nothing. He did not even look at her as he left. But the weight of the coat around her shoulders was warmer than any fire. The world turned white overnight. Elara awoke, not to the usual pale gray light of dawn, but to a strange, diffused luminescence. The wind, which had been a constant companion, had fallen silent. In its place was a profound, muffled stillness. She rose from her cot and went to the window, scraping a small patch of ice from the pane. Outside, the landscape was unrecognizable, buried beneath a thick blanket of snow. It clung to the branches of the lone pine tree, softened the sharp angles of the barn roof, and stretched in undulating drifts as far as the eye could see. It was beautiful, but it was a cold, predatory beauty. The silence was the silence of a world holding its breath. Silas was already awake, standing by the door and looking out. "Blizzard," he said. It was not an explanation, but a verdict. "We're snowed in. Could be for days." He turned from the door, his expression grim. "I'll need to check the livestock. Clear a path to the barn." The days that followed were a lesson in confinement. The small cabin, which had already felt confining, shrank with each passing hour. The world outside ceased to exist, replaced by the relentless, hypnotic swirl of wind and snow against the windows. The howling of the wind returned, a low, guttural moan that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the wilderness. It was a sound that frayed the nerves, a constant reminder of their isolation and vulnerability. They were two people trapped in a wooden box, adrift in a sea of white. The forced proximity was a tangible thing, a tension that hummed in the air between them. They moved around each other with a careful, practiced choreography, each hyper-aware of the other's presence. The silence, once a mere absence of noise, became charged, filled with unspoken thoughts and feelings. He spent his time methodically oiling his rifle, mending leather straps with an awl and thread, his large hands surprisingly deft. Alara turned to the only comfort she had ever known: books. She took out the small volume of poetry she had brought with her, the pages a fragile link to her past life. She read by the firelight, the words of Keats and Shelley, a stark contrast to the brutal reality of her surroundings. She could feel Silas's eyes on her occasionally, a brief, questioning glance before he returned to his work. Did he think her frivolous? A foolish woman clinging to useless things? She felt a prickle of defiance. This was a part of her he could not understand, a part she would not relinquish. One evening, the third of their confinement, a deep exhaustion settled over them both. The relentless wind had worn them down. Silas had spent the day battling the deepening drifts to feed the animals, and he fell asleep in his chair by the fire, his head slumped against his chest. The lines of strain around his eyes and mouth seemed to soften in sleep, revealing a vulnerability she had never seen before. He looked younger, less formidable. The fire, which he so diligently tended, began to die down. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, and a chill began to seep through the floorboards. Panic fluttered in Alara's chest. The fire was their shield against the killing cold. She looked at Silas, sleeping the sleep of the utterly spent, and knew she could not wake him. She had to do it herself. She had watched him countless times, but her knowledge was theoretical, untested. Her hands trembled as she picked up the heavy iron poker. She gently nudged the glowing embers, her movements tentative. She added a few small pieces of kindling, holding her breath, praying they would catch. A tiny flame flickered, hesitated, then grew stronger. Carefully, she laid a larger log onto the growing blaze. It hissed and smoked, and for one terrible moment she thought she had smothered it. But then the log caught, and a steady, reassuring flame wrapped around it. A wave of relief, so powerful it was dizzying, washed over her. She had done it. She had tamed the fire. She sank back onto her stool, her heart still pounding, and watched the flames dance. A short while later, Silas stirred. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the light of the now roaring fire. His gaze went from the hearth to her, sitting there with the poker still loosely in her hand. He looked at the perfectly stacked logs, the steady, bright flames. He did not smile. She was not sure he knew how, but he gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but in the charged silence of the snowbound cabin, it felt like a conversation. It was an acknowledgement, an approval, and for the first time, in this place that was supposed to be her prison, she felt a flicker of belonging. The blizzard broke as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind a world scoured clean and silent, glittering under a painfully bright sun. The snow was deep, but Silas deemed it passable. "We need supplies," he announced one morning, his words emerging in a cloud of frosted air as he stood in the open doorway. "The town will be open." The thought of seeing other people, of breaking the intense solitude of the homestead, sent a strange mix of excitement and trepidation through Alara. The journey to Endurance was slow, the horses struggling through the deep drifts, their breath misting in the frigid air. The silence in the wagon was different this time. The tension of their confinement had eased, replaced by a quiet, shared understanding. They had weathered the storm together, a small, two-person crew on a fragile ship. The world felt new, pristine, and for the first time, Alara noticed the stark beauty of it, the way the sunlight caught the ice on the branches of a cottonwood, the sharp, clean scent of the cold air, the vast, unbroken blue of the sky. Endurance was bustling with a frantic energy as homesteaders and ranchers from the surrounding area emerged from their enforced isolation to restock their larders. The town felt louder, cruder than Alara remembered. The stares she received were just as pointed, but now they were tinged with a knowing curiosity. She was no longer the mysterious newcomer. She was Silas Blackwood's mail-order wife. She could feel their judgments like a physical weight. As Silas conducted his business in the mercantile, she waited outside, trying to make herself small. A group of women, clustered near the doorway, spoke in low voices, their sharp glances flicking toward her. She heard a fragment of a sentence. Poor thing, married to that brute, and her cheeks burned with a hot, shameful flush. They saw her as a victim, a pitiable creature trapped with a grim, silent man. They didn't see the way he'd left his coat for her, or the quiet nod of approval by the fire. They didn't know him. A man swaggered out of the saloon across the street, his face fleshy and florid. He was flanked by two others, who looked like they were in his pay. He caught sight of Alara, and his lips curled into a sneer. "Well, well, Blackwood," he called out as Silas emerged from the store, his arms laden with sacks. "Finally bought yourself some company. Bet she cost a pretty penny. Does she do what she's told?" The man's laughter was coarse and ugly. Alara flinched, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She expected Silas to lash out, to meet the man's crude aggression with his own. She had seen the tightly coiled strength in him, the potential for violence that lay just beneath his stoic surface, but he did nothing of the sort. He simply stopped, his body going very still. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a threat. He just looked at the man. His gaze, cold and flat as riverstone, held the man's for a long, silent moment. The air grew thick and heavy. The man's sneer faltered, his bluster draining away under the weight of that silent, unyielding stare. He muttered something under his breath and turned away, motioning for his men to follow him. Silas did not acknowledge the confrontation. He loaded the supplies into the wagon, his movements as economical as ever. But Alara had seen it. He had protected her, not with fists or fury, but with the sheer force of his presence. He had drawn a line around her, a circle of quiet, formidable strength, and dared anyone to cross it. The women who had been whispering fell silent, their expressions shifting from pity to a grudging respect. On their way out of the store, Silas paused. Without a word, he picked up a bolt of deep blue wool, the fabric soft and richly colored. He paid the merchant and placed it in her lap in the wagon. It was not a gift of affection, not in the way the world understood it. It was practical. It was for a warmer dress, a defense against the unrelenting cold. But as her fingers stroked the soft material, she understood the gesture for what it was. It was his way of providing, of caring. It was a promise, spoken in his own silent language, that he would see her through the winter. The blue of the wool was the color of the sky after the storm, a color of hope. The lambing season arrived with the first tentative signs of spring. The iron grip of winter loosened, the snow receding to reveal the pale, sleeping earth beneath. It was a time of grueling work and anxious hope. The flock of sheep was the homestead's most valuable asset, and a successful lambing meant the difference between a lean year and a comfortable one. One night, a fierce, late-season storm blew in, rattling the cabin with gusts of wind and sleet. Silas had been keeping a close watch on a particular ewe, her first time lambing, and his instincts told him tonight would be the night. He went out to the barn, lantern in hand, and Alara was left with the howling wind for company. Hours passed. She tried to read, but the words blurred on the page, her mind consumed with a formless anxiety. Finally, unable to bear the waiting any longer, she pulled on his heavy coat, lit a second lantern, and battled her way through the driving sleet to the barn. The scene inside was one of quiet desperation. The air was thick with the scent of hay, lanolin, and fear. The ewe was down, her sides heaving, her cries weak and piteous. Silas was beside her, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his face etched with strain in the flickering lantern light. He was trying to help, but something was wrong. "It's turned," he said, his voice tight with frustration. He did not seem surprised to see her. "The lamb is breeched. I can't get a hold of it. My hands are too large." He spoke with a grim finality, as if he had already accepted the loss of both mother and child. Alara looked at the struggling animal, her heart twisting with a fierce, unexpected empathy. She thought of the books she had read, the countless hours spent absorbing information that had seemed so useless. A passage from the Animal Husbandry Guide surfaced in her memory. In a difficult breech birth, a smaller hand may succeed where a larger one fails. The key is to be gentle, but firm, to guide, not to force. "Let me try," she said, her voice clear and steady. Silas looked up at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and skepticism. "Your hands," she stated, holding them out. "They are smaller than yours." He hesitated for a long moment, the space between them filled with the ew's labored breathing. He was a man accustomed to relying on no one but himself. To accept her help was an admission of his own limitations, a profound act of trust. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire winter, he nodded and moved aside. "Be careful," he murmured. She knelt in the hay, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, but her determination was a fire that burned hotter. She spoke to the ewe in a low, soothing voice, her words a gentle stream of reassurance. Following the instructions from the book, she carefully, gently, reached inside. Silas held the lantern steady, his presence a solid, grounding force at her back. Time seemed to stop. It was just the two of them, the struggling animal and the storm raging outside. Then she felt it, a tiny hoof, then another. With painstaking slowness, she worked to turn the lamb, her fingers moving with a delicacy she didn't know she possessed. Finally, with a great, shuddering effort from the ewe, the lamb was born, sliding out into the hay, small and slick and miraculously alive. A few moments later, a second, smaller lamb followed with ease. Twins. The ewe, exhausted but alert, began to lick them clean. Silas let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for an eternity. He looked at Alara, her face smudged with dirt, her arms covered in the fluids of birth, and his eyes held a look she had never seen before. It was not gratitude, not precisely. It was something deeper. It was respect, awe. They worked together in the aftermath, their movements synchronized, clearing the soiled hay, ensuring the lambs were nursing. The storm outside still raged, but inside the warm, steamy confines of the barn, a profound peace had settled. They had fought for life, together, and won. The barrier of silence and solitude that had separated them for so long had been washed away in the messy, miraculous struggle. They were no longer just a man and his mail-order bride. They were partners. As they walked back to the cabin through the pre-dawn quiet, the storm having finally broken, he reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. He did not speak, but he didn't need to. His touch said everything. The warmth that had been born in the barn that night lingered in the small cabin, a gentle heat that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. The silences between them were no longer empty, but filled with a comfortable, shared understanding. They moved around each other with an easy familiarity, their lives intertwined in the daily rhythms of the homestead. The cot in the corner began to feel more and more like an artificial boundary, a relic of a time that had passed. One evening, as the last light of the day painted the prairie in soft hues of rose and lavender, Alara found the courage to ask the question that had been hovering in her thoughts for months. She gestured to the small, worn collection of books she had found. "Who taught you to read?" she asked softly. Silas was mending a bridle by the fire, his head bent over his work. He stilled, the needle pausing in mid-air. For a long moment, she thought he would not answer. The silence stretched, and she began to regret her intrusion into his carefully guarded past. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with an emotion she could not name. "My wife," he said, not looking at her. Her name was Mary. The name hung in the air between them, a ghost summoned into the room. He set the bridle aside and stared into the flames, his gaze distant, lost in a memory that was his alone. "She was a school teacher back in Ohio, came out here with me when this was nothing but grass and sky. She believed in this place." He fell silent again, and Alara waited, her heart aching for this man and the sorrow he had carried alone for so long. "She brought the books," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "Said a man wasn't whole if he couldn't read the words that shaped the world. She taught me my letters at this very table." He ran a hand over the rough-hewn wood, a gesture of profound tenderness. The fever took her 3 winters back. Fast. There was nothing I could do. The stark, simple words held a universe of pain. Now Elara understood. She understood the fortress of silence he had built around himself, the grim set of his jaw, the expectation of a cold and loveless marriage. He had not been preparing for a life without love. He had been preparing for a life where he could never risk loving again. Moved by a deep, compassionate impulse, she rose from her stool and went to him. She did not speak, for what words could possibly suffice? Instead, she laid a hand gently on his shoulder. He did not flinch or pull away. He simply sat there, under the light pressure of her touch, and for the first time, allowed his grief to show in the rigid line of his back, the clenching of his jaw. In that moment of shared, silent sorrow, Elara felt the last of her own walls crumble. She, too, knew the hollowness of loss, the sharp-edged reality of a world without the people you loved. "I lost my family," she said softly, giving voice to her own pain. "My parents, my brother, all of them, in a week." He turned his head then, and his storm-gray eyes met hers. In their depths, she saw not pity, but a profound, sorrowful understanding. They were 2 solitary souls, shipwrecked by life, who had found each other on this desolate shore. The space between them, once a chasm of fear and uncertainty, was now bridged by the strongest of materials: shared hardship, mutual respect, and the quiet, resilient tendrils of a love they had not sought but had undeniably found. They were no longer just surviving, they were beginning to heal. The fragile peace of their newfound connection was shattered by the man from town, the one with the florid face and cruel sneer. His name was Croft, and he was a rancher whose vast property bordered Silas's homestead. As the spring thaw quickened and the land came alive, it became clear that Croft's interest in Silas's property was more than just passing malice. The creek that flowed through Silas's land, providing life-giving water for his livestock, and the small vegetable garden Elara had started to cultivate, was the most reliable water source for miles. And Croft wanted it. At first, his tactics were petty acts of intimidation: a fence line cut in the night, a few sheep found spooked and scattered. Silas would repair the fence, his jaw set in a grim line, and spend hours rounding up the lost animals. He did not speak of Croft, but Elara saw the coiled tension in his shoulders, the watchful way he scanned the horizon. She knew he was trying to protect her from the ugliness of the conflict, but she refused to be sheltered. "This is my home too," she told him one evening, her voice firm. "I will not hide from threats against it." He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, which quickly turned to a deep, abiding respect. He nodded, accepting her as his ally. The situation escalated when Silas discovered a crew of Croft's men upstream, building a crude dam of rock and timber. They were trying to divert the creek, to choke the life from his homestead and force him out. The water level was already dropping, the cheerful babble of the creek diminishing to a sluggish trickle. This was no longer petty harassment. It was a declaration of war. Silas rode out to confront them, his face a mask of cold fury. Elara insisted on going with him. "You will not face this alone," she said, her resolve as unshakable as the granite hills. They found Croft overseeing the work, a smug look on his face. "This is my water, Blackwood," Croft sneered, gesturing to the dam. "You're nothing but a squatter. This land will be mine by summer." Silas dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, but every line of his body radiated a dangerous calm. "This is my claim," Silas said, his voice low and even. "Filed and legal. You touch this water, you're breaking the law." Croft laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Law? There's no law out here but what a man can take and hold, and I have more men than you." It was true. Croft had 6 hired hands with him, all of them hard-faced and armed. Silas and Elara were alone. A physical confrontation would be suicide. For a tense moment, they stood in a standoff, the only sounds the clatter of shovels and the mocking laughter of Croft's men. With a visible effort, Silas reined in his anger. He turned his horse without another word, a silent, tactical retreat. But as they rode away, Elara saw the look on Croft's face. It was not the look of a man who had won a simple victory. It was the look of a predator who had tasted blood and would soon be back for the kill. The ride back to the homestead was heavy, with a new, menacing silence. The threat was no longer a distant possibility. It was at their door. The attack came 3 days later, at dusk. Silas had ridden out to check the far fences, a grim premonition driving him to ensure his boundaries were secure. Elara was alone, finishing the evening chores. A sudden frantic barking from their dog, Rip, sent a jolt of alarm through her. She stepped out of the cabin, her heart pounding, and saw them. 3 riders, silhouetted against the blood-red sunset. It was Croft and 2 of his men, and they were carrying torches. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced her, but it was immediately followed by a white-hot surge of anger. They meant to burn them out. They meant to destroy everything she and Silas had built. The vulnerable woman who had stepped off the train months ago, a creature of fear and desperation, was gone. In her place was a woman fighting for her home. Her first instinct was to run, to hide. But where? The vast, open prairie offered no sanctuary. She thought of Silas, of the life they were just beginning to build. She would not let it turn to ash. Her mind raced, seizing on a desperate plan. She ran back inside the cabin, her hands steady, despite the tremor in her soul. She grabbed Silas's rifle from its pegs over the mantel. She had watched him clean and load it 100 times. Her hands knew the motions. She checked that it was loaded, then grabbed the powder horn and a pouch of shot. She ran to the back window, the one that faced the low rise of hills behind the cabin. She fired a single shot into the air. The report cracked through the evening quiet, a sharp, clear signal. Silas would hear it. He would know something was wrong. He would come. Now, she just had to buy him time. She could hear the men's coarse laughter as they dismounted, confident in their numbers and their victim's helplessness. "No need to be shy, little lady," Croft called out. "We just want to warm the place up for you." She slipped out the back door, using the growing darkness as cover. She knew this land now, its dips and hollows, the game trails that wound through the sagebrush. She moved swiftly, circling around behind the barn. She fired another shot, this time from the west, aiming high over their heads. The bullet whined into the darkness, and the men cursed, spinning around in confusion. They thought she was in the cabin. Now they were not so sure. She kept moving, a phantom in the twilight, using the terrain to her advantage. She was no longer just Nora Vane from Boston. She was a defender of this small patch of earth, as fierce and territorial as any wolf. She led them on a frantic chase through the scrubland, firing sporadically, making them believe they were facing more than one person, keeping them disoriented and away from the cabin and barn. But they were closing in. She could hear their heavy footsteps crashing through the brush. She scrambled behind a rocky outcropping, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and began to reload. It was then that she heard it, the thunder of hoofbeats, faster and more powerful than a tired farm horse. Silas! He burst over the crest of a nearby hill, a dark, avenging figure on horseback. He didn't slow down. He rode straight into the fray, leaping from his horse before it had even stopped. The fight was brutal and swift. Silas moved with a focused, terrifying efficiency, his fists like hammers. He was not fighting for land or for water. He was fighting for her. As he took down one of Croft's men, the other came at him from behind. "Silas!" Elara screamed. Without thinking, she raised the rifle she had just finished reloading, took aim, and fired. She didn't aim to kill, but to wound. The bullet tore through the man's shoulder, and he dropped with a cry of pain. Croft, seeing his men defeated and facing a furious Silas and an armed Elara, lost his nerve. He scrambled onto his horse and fled into the night, leaving his wounded men behind. The silence that descended was sudden and absolute, broken only by the whimpering of the injured man and their own ragged breathing. They had won, together. In the aftermath of the fight, the world seemed to shrink to the small, intimate circle of lantern light inside the cabin. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and a quiet sense of awe. They worked together, tending to their wounds, Silas had a cut on his cheek and bruised knuckles. Ilara had scratches on her arms from her flight through the sagebrush. She cleaned his cut with a gentle, practiced touch, her fingers tracing the hard line of his jaw. He held a damp cloth to a long scratch on her forearm, his gaze intense, filled with a tumult of emotions she could finally read: fear for her safety, pride in her courage, and a deep, overwhelming love. The last of the unspoken things between them finally fell away, not in a rush of words, but in the profound silence of shared understanding. They had faced down the worst the world could throw at them, and had not just survived, but triumphed. They had forged a partnership in the crucible of hardship, a bond stronger than any legal document or spoken vow. Later, as the fire burned low, Silas stood and walked to the corner of the room. He lifted her narrow cot, its presence a stark reminder of the distance that had once separated them. He carried it to the hearth and, with a few powerful swings of his axe, broke it down into kindling. He fed the pieces to the fire, the wood catching and burning brightly, consuming the last symbol of their old arrangement. Then he turned to her and held out his hand. She took it without hesitation, his calloused palm warm and strong around hers. He led her to the large bed built against the wall, the bed he had shared with a memory for so long. He was not replacing his past, she knew, but building a future. This was not an act of necessity, but of choice, of love. She was no longer a mail-order bride, a stranger in a strange land. She was his wife, his partner, his equal. The next morning, they stood together on the small porch, the rising sun warming their faces. The air was clean, washed new by the night's violence. The creek, which Silas had cleared of Croft's dam before dawn, once again gurgled and flowed, its voice a happy, constant promise. The land stretched out before them, vast and unforgiving, but it was no longer a threat. It was not a prison, but a kingdom, their kingdom. It was a place where two broken people had found not only survival, but salvation in each other. He slipped his arm around her waist, drawing her close to his side. She leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. The world was still a hard place, and their life would never be easy. There would be more storms, more droughts, more hardships to face, but they would face them together. She had come to this place expecting a cold and loveless life, a marriage of silent, grim necessity. She had found, instead, a home, and in the heart of this quiet, stoic man, she had found a love as fierce, as resilient, and as vast as the land itself.